AI and machine learning bias is a problem that has emerged recently with the advent of technologies allowing for facial recognition and surveillance. Some of these models used for these implementations are not accurate for all ethnicities and genders, and this results in some complications in both processing and using them for prediction. AI bias, which is sometimes also commonly referred to as machine learning bias, is a phenomenon occurring when an algorithm designed by hand produces results that are systematically prejudiced against a group of people due to erroneous assumptions in the developed machine learning model, either due to insufficient testing or training guidelines. The efficiency of a machine learning model depends on the quality, objectivity, and size of the training data that is used to teach it. A collection of faulty or incomplete data will result in inaccurate predictions. AI bias also stems from problems introduced by individuals who train machine learning systems. These algorithms could potentially reflect real life cognitive biases. According to researchers, facial recognition models and technologies like iPhones and traffic cameras falsely identify black and Asian faces 10 to 100 times more often than they do white faces. The technologies also falsely identify women more often than they do for men, making black women particularly vulnerable to algorithmic bias.
To better understand the mechanisms behind AI bias within facial recognition, we need to look at how this software works. Facial recognition software relies on biometrics, biological distances to map the facial features of different users. How these different algorithms works varies, but generally these measures are used to perform mathematical calculations. These calculations are then used to detect, map, and match different faces. To increase the efficiency and accuracy of these algorithms, many of these APIs keep a database of facial signatures based on the biometrics of a user's face. However, the rise of this software has also exposed its drawbacks, one being racial bias. A recent study by MIT found that the databases of many of these algorithms lack diversity. This lack of diversity leads to a lack of accuracy when identifying minorities. It was also found that generally facial recognition software incorrectly identified white men the least. A recent example of these drawbacks was the wrongful arrest of Robert Williams. Williams was arrested based on facial recognition software. However, when it was brought in, he found out that the man in the photo looked nothing like him. This was the first time a wrongful arrest of this nature was found, but it begs the question of how many more wrongful identifications have taken place. Another recent example is a group of Uber drivers protesting the use of facial verification technology. Many of the protesters had their accounts banned on Uber because the photos they submitted for identification were denied. In 2018, a similar version of the software that denied them was found to fail in 1 in 5 darker-skinned female faces and 1 in 17 darker-skinned male faces. These stories are all examples of AI bias within facial recognition software.
So now that we've taken a look at what AI and machine learning bias is and seen some examples, let's talk about why it matters. If it isn't already clear, all of our lives are going down an increasingly technology-filled path. The scale of this issue is therefore global, and any problems will have ripple effects on society as a whole. AI bias isn't just an inconvenience. It reflects the bias of both the creators and the users. As everyday life grows increasingly intertwined with technology, erasure through algorithms becomes erasure in real life. The earlier example of false arrests is just one example of how things can go wrong. AI is already deeply embedded into a number of society's institutions. Predictive policing can create negative feedback loops. Something as innocent as a YouTube recommendation system can lead down a rabbit hole of radicalization. Many machine learning algorithms become black boxes where even the creators don't know how conclusions are drawn. What this means is that we need to remain vigilant of bias in our creations, even inadvertent bias. Most people set out to create good programs. The problem lies in human fallibility. This is why regulation and policy are so important to provide another layer of protection.
In recent years, the Federal Trade Commission has been actively pursuing legislation to reduce the prevalence of racially biased algorithms from entering our consumer spaces. This has given rise to important laws like the Fair Credit Reporting Act, or FCRA. While the FCRA was originally written before the age of AI, it has always included strong language that strictly prohibits companies from utilizing aggregated data about their users in a discriminatory manner. Additionally, whenever a company does decide to use consumer information in order to make a decision about that consumer, such as credit approvals, employment, or insurance matters, the company must have just cause to do so, and said consumer must be notified accordingly. In recent years, the FCRA's language has been modified to include information obtained from AI tracking and facial recognition software. Such legislation is actively preventing biased or illegitimate algorithms from being utilized in a consumer space, which is definitely a step in the right direction in terms of reducing the prevalence of AI's biases, discriminatory practices. As the world continues to adapt and bring technology into a new age of even more advanced discoveries, the FTC will continue to adapt its policies to fit the current models most needed. Ethically speaking, this is a step in the right direction, although the real effects from such efforts remain to be seen, as algorithmic bias is merely a reflection of pre-existing racial bias that occurs between humans and society every day.
The future of AI is uncertain yet quickly evolving, taking over sectors such as security and defense, healthcare, and many other fields. It has become paramount for strong governance to uphold standards during these developments. The U.S. government is quickly catching on to the need to enact legislation aimed at reducing or eliminating bias. In 2021 alone, AI bills or resolutions were introduced in 17 states and were enacted in 4. But not only governmental intervention is at play when looking towards ethical AI. Ethical governance helps stakeholders balance the benefits and trade-offs for those who will be using or who might be affected by the algorithms. One Illinois bill requires employers that rely on AI to determine whether applicants qualify for an in-person interview to report demographic information to the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. The department is then required to analyze the data to decide whether the data discloses a racial bias in the use of artificial intelligence. This kind of legislation is helpful because it motivates businesses to do their homework in reducing algorithmic and societal bias. Having a dedicated committee to evaluate the ethics of a model, or simply stakeholders who are empowered to ask pointed questions, can go a long way toward harm reduction. By helping organizations operationalize the way they provide governance, AI can be safely scaled in a way that continues to deliver a positive contribution to our lives. Like most great technological advances, AI can be a force for good and bad. To stay on the right side of humanity, governance processes must be wrapped around its development and use.